Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May God's peace, blessings, and mercy be upon you. Welcome back to another show, another episode of Knowledge to Action. Our episode today asks a fundamental question. It's a closed-ended question, meaning you can answer it either yes or no. Are you ready for change? Now we're going to talk to our audience today about what problems need changing. But there's an error in the title of our question because it's not as clear-cut. It's not yes or no. It's degrees of readiness. Change begins not with the moment you want to change. Change begins with the moment you know you need to change. So the change process, the stages of change, doesn't begin with action. It begins with knowledge. So let us talk a little bit about knowledge. Let us talk about the knowledge of change. Let us talk about the knowledge of problems, and let us talk about the knowledge of development. But first, what is knowledge? How many different types of knowledge is there? You know, sometimes people say, this is what you need to do to solve your problem. And you can easily ask them, show me your proof. What's your evidence? And there's different types of knowledge. Usually people will say, well, a friend of mine did it, so it must work for you. It doesn't always work, right? Mm-hmm. You and his friend are totally different. Or they might say, well, I read it in a book. Okay, well, show me the book. But it could be right. Or perhaps they'll say, there's research, evidence. They have scientifically controlled for these variables. And then you have to ask yourself, were the people that they studied Muslim? Because being Muslim makes a huge difference. Islam impacts so many things. Later in the sessions, we'll start to identify some of the unique factors on what distinguishes two people from each other, a Muslim and perhaps somebody from another faith. But for now, let us focus on these different types of knowledge. Research is showing in the literature that there's about 8. That's not all of it, but these 8 that I'll briefly mention to you, to just stop and think. When you base your action on knowledge, what type of knowledge is it? Is it propositional knowledge? That's the knowledge of concepts and ideas. You know, the idea of development, the idea of change. It's based on the concept that if you are motivated to change, you'll change. Or is it based on experiential knowledge? That knowledge that you've experienced, you've been face to face with it. You've seen it yourself. You've seen in your own self the change that you've made. Or you've seen somebody in your family that's changed. A third one is presentational knowledge. Stories, movies, videos. When we talk about change, who is the one person that usually gets mentioned time and time and time again? Famous Sahabi. You're right.
Umar ibn al-Khattab.
Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar ibn al-Khattab is always an example of change, of drastic change. What changed about Umar ibn al-Khattab? Was Umar ibn al-Khattab's soul evil? No. His behaviors were before he converted to Islam. We know what he used to do. In fact, can you imagine anything worse than murder? And not just any type of murder. Murdering an innocent person who's trying to change society for the better. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, of course, may God be pleased with him, was on his way to kill the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he changed. And he became one of the greatest men that ever walked this earth. After the Prophets and after Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. He changed. What was involved in his change? Let me give you another example of a context that we need to identify, that we need to recognize before even starting to talk about change. Knowledge of people. There's a story. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that a prostitute was forgiven because she had empathy for a dog. She cared for an animal. And God saw that and forgave her. Now we could talk about the job and her deeds and all that, but I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about what got her in that position to begin with. Have you ever tried to identify the context around her life? The Prophet tells us she's forgiven. We don't need to focus on the problem. We can focus on the solution. But in order to do that, you need to understand the context of a person. And remind me, a little later on in the show, we're going to have to explain context. Other forms of knowledge, practical knowledge, that's what we're trying to do here today. We're trying to disseminate, we're trying to provide you, our viewers, with practical knowledge. Knowledge that you can actually practice. Smiling, we'll talk about in another session. It's a skill. It does so much. That's knowledge that can be practical. Wajhun taliq, inviting face. Then there are others, functional representational knowledge. So for example, you have correlational studies and causal relationship studies. Cause, effect. There's a antecedent, something happens before, leads to something else. So I want you all to think about a problem. And think about what has caused that problem. Or better yet, think about a behavior that you feel is problematic. You want to change it. What led to that? There's another aspect. What is correlated with it? What is it highly associated with that problematic behavior? When we talk about prevention, preventing a problem from happening, a lot of times we mention two main points: risk factors and protective factors. Risk factors are all those things that increase the likelihood of the problem pursuing or beginning. Protective factors are those issues that protect the individual from facing that problem. It doesn't mean that if you have all the risk factors and all the protective factors that the problem won't happen. It just means that it's correlated. It's very highly likely that you wouldn't. And we can discuss that when we move over to the board after the break. But what's usually missing from Western-based studies is the norm that over 1 billion people in the world follow. It's the norm of Islam. The belief in one God. The belief in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as his messenger. The belief in an afterlife, in a heaven and a hell. All of these factors can be translated into some serious action. And so our program aims to take this knowledge, revealed knowledge, and translate it into sustainable action. But what is action? Action comes almost near the end of the change process. So you might ask, what is change? We've already established that change, there's a difference that's occurring. So allow me to walk you through the stages of change. As we mentioned, change, the stages of change doesn't begin with action. It begins with knowledge, an awareness of some sort, an awareness that you know you need to change, that something about your life needs to be different. Usually, the stage of change, the first stage in the stage of change model, is that you're not ready for change, is that you don't even know you need to change. And that's the worst stage to be in. Because if you don't know you need to change, or if you don't want to change, nothing's going to change. Yeah. However, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was approached one day. And the man said, when is the hour? When is the day of judgment? Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam responded in a way that gave the individual an awareness for action. He said, what have you prepared for it? And in so many cases, when we attend maybe a program, when we watch TV and you see something that kind of raises your awareness, usually it's focusing on the pros and cons. Usually it's focusing on, you need to change this behavior. And I'm keeping it vague and general because I want everybody, all the viewers at home, to identify one problem in your life and ask yourself whether you need to change it or not. And ask yourself the fundamental question of this episode, are you ready for change? We're going to take a short break. But when we come back from the break, we're going to take this knowledge of change and turn it into action. We'll see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May God's peace, blessings and mercy be upon you. Welcome back. Now it's time to take knowledge and convert it into action. Let's talk about problems. What problems do you face? Or better yet, because it's a little difficult to talk about our own problems, what problems do people that ask for your help face? We're going to do two things today. We're going to list all those problems as much as we can, because shura, consultation, is an essential piece of initiating change. It's a value in Islam that you engage people in the process. And so we're going to list as many problems as we can. But what we're also going to do is we're going to start to list some of the risk and protective factors. Aspects that contribute to that problem and aspects that decrease that problem. And you're going to start to see something interesting. You're going to start to see that one protective factor can cover so many problems, can protect from so many problems. All right? So, can I get one of you to head up to the board, please? Go ahead. Yeah. All right. Now, you might be thinking, well, what do you mean by problem? My answer to you is, what do you mean by problem? Because how I define a problem might be a little different. But usually, there's two areas. Either we identify it as a problem or somebody else identifies it as a problem for us. So there's your parameters. Okay? There's no limitation here. So why don't we start with you. Name one problem that you think needs to be changed. And then we're going to speed it up so we can list as much as we can.
Okay, name stress.
Stress. Excellent one.
Marriage.
Marriage, like marriage problems, or
Yes.
marriage as a problem?
No, marriage problem.
Okay, marriage problems. What else?
Smoking.
Smoking.
I like that one.
Okay. So unhealthy behaviors. All right. Okay. What else do we got?
Anger.
Anger. Anger is a natural reaction to many things, and if not managed properly, it could lead to some serious behavioral issues. We'll talk about that definitely in sessions to come. What else?
Hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy. Okay. So what do you mean by hypocrisy?
I mean, being double-faced mainly.
Okay. So relationship issues. So you act one way in front of somebody, but then you act a totally different way. And of course, there's also the religious aspect of hypocrisy, right? If you speak, you lie. If you promise something, you don't fulfill that promise. And if you're entrusted with something, you break that trust. Well, those are definitely aspects of interpersonal relationship problems, and we can talk about that as well. What else do we got?
I'd add inactivism.
Inactivism. Can you be a little more specific?
Just a lack of motivation. We're talking about knowledge to action. So lack of action, pretty much.
Absolutely. Okay, so lack of motivation to actually get started towards change. So all of these problems we're starting to identify, and I'm sure our viewers at home can fill this page up. And we will do that. We will continue writing down problems and present that to you on the next session. So I'd like to move now to factors that relate to change, that are associated with change. So if you were to say, let's just take one. Let's say stress. Now imagine you wanted to change the problem of stress. What would your first step be?
I have no idea.
Okay, exactly. That is a perfect place to be in. Okay, acknowledge that. Well, you just don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Right. We call that conscious incompetence. You're aware that you don't know how to do something. Right. It's worse to be unconsciously incompetent, meaning that you're not even aware you don't know how to do it. So you're offering solutions and telling people do this or do that, and it could even be increasing their stress.
Yeah.
Right? So we got to be very careful. We got to be trustworthy when it comes to our abilities to help. Right? So we don't know where to start. Usually we start by identifying what impact is stress having on this individual's life. See, sometimes stress is important, right? Or else imagine everything was just perfect. See, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't live a stress-free life. But the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had shown us the best example of what it's like to be content with what Allah has given you. As he says, be content with what Allah has given you, you will be the richest of people. You have no wants. So these principles are very important. We'll identify several aspects of stress management. We'll talk about how anxiety leads to stress. We'll talk about problems with anxiety, and we'll see some of the interconnections here. What will make you more stressed? And what will make you less stressed?
I'd say probably more tasks, adding more tasks and tasks to your life, adding
Right.
more problems.
So when you
Complex.
don't have the resources to meet the needs, that'll lead to stress. If you don't have enough time, if you don't have enough financial resources, if you just don't have the skills to deal with something, that will increase your stress. So what aspects, did you want to write that down?
Sure.
Okay.
So complications, I guess.
Okay. And what
Adding more
factors
tasks.
decrease stress or associated with decreasing stress?
Having a lot, facing a little.
Okay, so having a lot yet facing a little. Okay. So having extra resources
Extra resources.
will decrease stress.
Well,
It's tough, right?
yeah.
That's important. Let's stop right there, okay?
Because mainly
I
we're all
want you to
stressed.
stay in that state of mind. that uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah.
That like, what? I'm on TV. I don't know how to answer. We didn't try this. Why didn't you give us some time to prepare? Oh my God. All of those factors are extremely important because those imply the context. Those shroud you with the context of the problem. See, just because you don't have resources doesn't make it make you more stressed or less stressed. Every issue, usually in most cases, is very unique to the individual. You cannot assume, my dear brothers and sisters, our viewers, you cannot assume that there's a one quick fix pill, one thing that will solve all your problems. You cannot assume that there's a one way of doing something. What we're going to do over the next 28 sessions is we're going to start to scaffold, as we said. We're going to take basic skills and apply them to problems. And you're going to find, after 28 sessions, this exercise will be extremely easy. But right now, it's okay not to know. It's okay to be in a situation of not knowing. Because how often have you been in your own problem and you didn't know how to respond? You didn't know how to fix the problem?
Most of the time.
Most of the time, right? Or how often did somebody come to you asking for help? You didn't even know where to start. What are you supposed to do? You know the ahadith, you know the verses in the Quran. You have that driving force that you want to help people so Allah can help you. You want to relieve them of difficulties and stress and help them with marriage issues and unhealthy behaviors and emotional management and being true and upstanding individual with integrity. You want to help all of these things, but you don't know where to start. Or how often did you try to help somebody or yourself, and you try and you try and you try with no outcomes? So it's extremely important to identify what the problem is, but within a context. If you were to see somebody smoking, or if you were to see somebody angry, or if you were to see somebody with any problem, what's your initial reaction? Or better yet, what impressions do you make of people? The first time you meet somebody, what's your impression of that individual?
Whatever he shows us.
Right? Whatever he shows. Now, some studies have shown that if the individual appears warm, amongst many other factors, many other characteristics, if they appear warm, you're more likely to think of them as a positive individual. But if they appear cold, you're going to think of them as negative. Now imagine, some brothers have, nice big black beard. If they don't smile, they look angry. They look intimidating. I have a friend of mine or a relative of mine. He looks mean. If he doesn't smile, he looks mean. You could only imagine what people think of him. But when he smiles, the world changes. When he smiles, those bright teeth, the black beard, the figure of the ground, it accentuates. And so, we have to be very cautious not to give off a cold vibe whenever we're helping people. We're still in the early stages of our scaffold. We're still developing the foundations. But it's extremely important. If you want to help somebody, you have to, you must consider their context. Let me end with a story. I want you to imagine this scenario. You're in the mosque. The mosque is supposed to be a quiet place, a peaceful place. You're getting ready for prayer. You've had a very stressful day. You want to now turn to your Creator and meditate and relax. And all of a sudden there's a few kids, a few children. And they're jumping up and down and they're running, and one of them's on the minbar and one of them's throwing the books around. And you have some of the elders trying to pray, trying to relax. You have an individual who's been spending the last 40 years trying to concentrate in prayer, and he's not getting it, and he's frustrated. Now you have these little kids running all over the place. To add to that, dad's just sitting there, staring off into the distance, as though they don't even exist. What would you think of a guy like that? What's your impression of a person like that? So somebody comes up to him and he says, "Brother, watch your kids. Watch your children." So he snaps out of his hypnosis and he says, "You're right. I should do something, but you see, we just left the hospital and their mother died and they don't know how to handle it. And frankly, neither do I." Now what's your impression of that individual? Join us next time as we talk about how impressions are formed and what causes behavior. And we'll go through the stages of helping a person to get from where they are to where they want to be. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.